Well, look, I want to talk about that. I also want to talk about my plant-based year last year. My grandpa, Benedict, which was my mother's father, had a feedlot just outside of Phoenix, Arizona. And he was a cattleman all of his life. And a feedlot, for people that don't know, is like 10,000 head of cattle being fed right before they die with like a high concentrate of grains in order to get their weight up, and then boom. And I remember as a kid going to visit the feedlot, and all I could remember was how bad it smelled, because it was just really bad. And it was these animals about to be killed. And I remember we would take a half a cow home every year, and we would literally drive it from Arizona to San Diego. And I grew up around this. And funny enough, you know, Neal, I remember my brother and sister kind of started going vegetarian when I was a kid. And my grandpa, I mean, he almost had a heart attack. I mean, he later had a heart attack, but he just didn't know how to process that back in the 80s, that anyone would think that way, you know?
But it's enough to make you a vegetarian. I remember when I was a kid, and my father had left the cattle business, but we nonetheless drove some cattle to the stockyards in East St. Louis. And as we were bringing the cows off the truck, you could see the look in their eyes. They're scared. You know, of course, they're a product. They're just, you know, their value is just based on the pound. But you can look in their eyes and you can see a scared animal, and they were messy because they'd been pushed all around in the truck. Some of them were injured. They'd come down and you'd think, is this really civilization at its best? And I have to say, I think we can do better than that.
Yeah, I guess it was another one of those things, like, you know, you just eat what's on your plate, and you just kill these animals because that's what we've always done. So.
And you think you have to.
Yeah.
And some people believe then, and some still imagine that you can't get protein without it, or whatever. Culture has a tremendous amount of momentum, and it really keeps us going.
Yeah, I think
in a not very helpful way.
Yeah, most people have no idea or would never admit that most of their decisions are based on what they see, and they just repeat other people's behavior, you know.
Oh, logic plays almost no role in human behavior. I really mean that. You know, when a person plans their breakfast, they don't think, I'd like to have maybe 15 grams of fiber and could use some beta carotene. They don't do that. It's culture, number one, what you grew up with and what your friends do. Noise, number two. By noise, I mean you turn on the television, it's this new product and that new product. And then there's wishful thinking and addictions and money. When people get more money, they start eating in a maybe not so healthful way. You see that in China now, for example. China's got enough money, they can dramatically increase their pork intake, and so diabetes is going up in that country. But no, logic plays almost no role in not only in our food choices, but almost anything else that humans do, unfortunately. But nonetheless, we appeal to that little sliver of logic and something to see if we can turn human behavior around.
Yeah, no, I know. And I remember my mom had me on non-fat milk because that was what was being talked about, like in the 70s and 80s. It was like, so we were on skim milk because fat was bad, or fat made you fat, or I don't know. And then later, there was always a trend based on kind of what was happening. But I just finished on the cattle thing. Yeah, something probably inside of me thought something's not right here, you know, because it just, I mean, if you've ever been to a feedlot, it's just like, it's not a natural smell. It's pretty bad.
Yes.
And there's a lot of death there too, or soon to be death. So, how did that upbringing then kind of take you on the route you're on now? Because you could have kind of been a clone of your dad, or just continued down that path. What was the thing that really switched your
a couple things. One was in later high school, I was an exchange student in Europe for just a summer program. Very short, just a couple of months. I was in northern Belgium, where the language is Flemish, so my high school French didn't help me at all. But I was plunked into a family that didn't share my North Dakota Republican Protestant views of anything, and the kids in the city it was a village. The kids in the village would make fun of me because I didn't speak a word of the language. And the family I lived with, they were lovely, but they made fun of this American capitalist boy who didn't share kind of their values. Anyway, to be in a different family, different language, different religion, different everything, and then to get thrown right back into Fargo. I just got the bends. And for the next year or so, I found myself rethinking all of the values that I'd grown up with. And then went to college, and it was a liberal time with civil rights and so forth welling up. But then, the year before I went to medical school, I had a peculiar experience. I was working in a hospital in Minneapolis as the autopsy assistant. And down in the morgue was in the basement. Nobody would ever go down there. The phone was probably from the 1940s. It would make this big click. The phone guy didn't want to go in the morgue. So, but that was my job. And when a person died in the hospital, I would prepare the body for the pathologist to do the autopsy. And a guy died in the hospital of a massive heart attack, and probably from eating hospital food, but that's another story. So the pathologist knew that I was going to go to medical school the following year, and so he made this a lesson for me every time. So he made this big incision in the skin and pulled the skin back and cut through the ribs and took this huge wedge of ribs off the chest and put it on the table. And then suddenly you see this heart. He says, look in the coronary arteries. They're called coronaries because they crown the heart. He took his scalpel and he opened one of the coronaries, and he said, look inside. So I got my gloves on, I poke around inside. And it was not this rubbery, flexible artery. It felt like concrete. And he said, bacon and eggs, Neal. What are you talking about? He said, atherosclerotic disease has killed this man. And then he opened the carotids to the brain, the carotid arteries, the big arteries that go up your neck. Same process there. The renal arteries, the arteries to the legs, the same atherosclerotic process. Okay, he's done. He writes up his notes, myocardial infarction, massive systemic atherosclerotic disease. He leaves. I take the ribs, put them back in the chest, sew up everything, clean up, and I went up to the cafeteria afterward. And they were serving ribs for lunch. And I have to say, I looked at it and I thought, it was just like the body. And the smell of it was the smell of a body. And it was not a human body, but I thought, this is a dead body. And I didn't become a vegetarian on the spot, but I couldn't eat it. I couldn't take it. I mean, I couldn't put it on my plate. And so anyhow, this started to work on my brain. And then I started medical school right after that. And you can't unlearn something like that. So that was, for me, a bit of a turning point.